Addiction Specialist. I'm Bob Weathers.
Odie Martinez.
Very happy to have all of you here with Odie and me. We're also sitting with Austin Armstrong. He's our engineer and man about town today in the office. He'll be here not only handling the production of what we're going to be discussing today, but also will be here to field questions. And so let me just bookmark that right now. If you have any comments or questions as we're moving forth today, you can reach him through Ask an Addiction Specialist, the Facebook group, and he'll be happy to relay those questions or comments to Odie and I in real time. So thank you all again for being here. Really appreciate it. Just as by way of quick review, I'm a recovery coach by background, which comes via psychology. So my background's in psychology, and we look at addiction each week and recovery, primarily from a psychological perspective. We bring in biological and medical perspectives. We bring in spiritual perspectives, but the primary focus is psychological. Last week, I encourage you to check out our archives, which are available on YouTube, as well as through Beginnings Treatment Centers. By the way, thank you to Beginnings Treatment Centers and Therapy Cable for sponsoring us each week here at Ask Addiction Specialist. If you go to those archives, you can check out last week's presentation, which was titled simply Cheap versus Costly Grace. We were looking at grace or forgiveness from the perspective of kind of the paradox of the fact that it's freely given and also that we need to sometimes work to earn it. And it's both of those at the same time. So I highly recommend that you check that out. Today's presentation is kind of opening up the conversation about forgiveness. Certainly we've talked a lot about shame over the past months. And today it's imagining, the title is Imagine a World Without Shame. What would that world would even look like? And so we'll touch briefly on shame, but spend a little bit more time looking at some of the derivatives of shame, how that manifests in our relationships, not just with one another, but with people at large. I want to start by sharing with you a quote. Many of you will be familiar with this. It's a quote from Albert Einstein. It's coming on the screen as we speak. There's different ways that this has been worded, but in essence, he says what you'll see here in this slide. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. I'm going to take that quote and apply it not to physics, which was his background, but apply it to psychology, and I think it's perfectly pertinent. Specifically, if what I'm dealing with is a sense of shame, particularly in the context of looking at addiction or recovery. So oftentimes what happens is that individuals, in fact I've led two groups today, one just a few minutes ago, in which the topic was self-forgiveness. And why we brought this up today is it's quite difficult for those who have experienced addiction oftentimes not to move from I've done something wrong to a more serious self-indictment, which is I am somebody wrong. In other words, there's something broken or defective and hopeless about my situation. So to move from addiction and taking responsibility for it, we move into a deeper place that we're fundamentally flawed. And there are lots of difficulties with that psychologically. The primary difficulty is that shame, I'm defective, I'm flawed, will most often immobilize us. We were talking in the group right now before I left the treatment center of how it is that if I've done something to offend you or you to offend me, we're actually discussing it in real time in the group. And I use myself as the point person, and I said, because they were talking about a specific situation that had come up in a living arrangement for several people in the group, and I said, if I'm the one who, so that wasn't hard to do.
Yeah,
so they looked at me and they said, are we going to shame you, Dr. Bob? I said, yes, please do. And so they did, and it was effective. I crawled into a little hole in the corner of the room, and I said, can we revisit this situation? Is there a way to communicate your displeasure? It was something that happened in the house that made one or two people very unhappy. Is there a way to communicate that just as it is for you, but without having to put me down, label me, or blame me? And so they worked at it, and they were able to communicate with a lot of feeling, but it didn't have the same finger pointing, having to put me down type of sense, and made all the difference. It was abundantly clear in the room. So that division is easy maybe to make in abstraction, but it's hard to do when we're ticked off.
Yeah.
So in the spirit of Einstein, if somebody is dealing with shame, let's say that it's you and me with ourselves, where it's hard to forgive ourselves for behaviors that we've committed in the past that we don't feel proud of, and that it edges over into being a blanket statement about Odie or a blanket statement about Bob. That to try to heal that shame by further shame obviously is part of the problem, and that's really what he's saying.
Yeah.
I adapt Einstein. I must be very careful to not create another problem for myself with the means by which I would like to solve that problem, in this case shame. Let me be sure not to shame myself for being ashamed. It looks like you have a thought.
No, I'm processing everything.
You're just processing it. You will have a thought, and then when you're ready,
it will come.
You will share with me.
And I will interrupt.
I'll tell you something. It was great today. We had a guest. We had a guest that had graduated from Beginnings many months ago, and he came today to speak to the group. I really care a lot about this man. And he came to speak to the group, and as he was sharing, I was flashing back to all the previous groups that we'd been in together.
Right.
And in fact, in every group that I led, he sat right where you're sitting. He'd sit right next to me. Every group I'd come in, he'd sit right next to me. But he was primarily quiet. He didn't say much.
Just like me.
Well, if I ever would stop talking, right?
No.
That was probably the case there too. But what I was struck by today is that he was actively taking in information. He's really incorporated that into his life, and he's got now a good chunk of time, 6-9 months of solid sobriety post treatment under his belt. And he came to the group today to share that. And after he completed sharing at least one of the passes through what he was sharing, I told him what I just told you. I said, you know, you can never tell where things land, because he was pretty quiet.
Yeah.
And I would invite him. I would invite everybody to speak. And I just think some people are more introverted than others.
Yeah.
But he was incredibly active as a learner. And it's well evident now when he stands in front of the group of other men who themselves are in recovery and tells his story and the things that he's learned and how he's integrated those. It was very impressive. So I know you're doing the same.
Yes.
So if I have to be careful a la Einstein in terms of shaming myself for the struggles I have with my shame, then what is it that will heal shame? And I'd like to suggest this next slide names it explicitly, is that only empathy will heal shame. We've talked about this in past podcasts, that the opposite of shame, in terms of for each one of us individually, is self-compassion. They don't coexist. Self-compassion is the opposite of shame. Another word for self-compassion would be empathy, whether it's for another person or for myself. Right. One example of empathy that we've practiced over and over again over the last, it's been over a year now. There have been several sessions that have been dedicated to forgiveness practice, where we actually practice asking for forgiveness from others, offering forgiveness to others, but most crucially, offering forgiveness or receiving forgiveness for ourselves. And so I recommend you to those podcasts. You can find them if you look them up. There's just one after the other, just titled self-compassion or self-forgiveness practice. And so one example of how it is that empathy will heal shame is not by doing that just once, but finding some way to do that regularly. Today I asked a question in the first group I led: how is it that you all deal with self-forgiveness in light of the fact that all of us who have experienced active addiction have undoubtedly not only let down ourselves, but let down people in our lives that we love. We've disappointed them. Sometimes we've betrayed trusts and so on. And the very first woman to my left that answered, she says, Dr. Bob, I do it by praying. And so I said, that's wonderful. Tell me more how you do it. So she began to discuss how she prays. And her prayer puts her in a position of humility. Humility before God, but humility also before the person from whom she wants forgiveness. And I thought you could, that's a good place to start, is to be humble enough to acknowledge that I've done you wrong, and that I need help, I need your support, and I'd like to ask for your forgiveness. So
Perfect.
far so good?
Yeah.
We're gonna keep on
Say
going.
anything about that.
Now the alternative to this prayer, or the alternative to forgiving ourselves, the forgiveness practice that we've utilized, the alternative can go sideways in a nanosecond. And there's a couple ways this can go. We can go towards shaming ourselves, and we just stay mired in the tar pit of self-judgment. We've spent a lot of time discussing that over the last mini podcasts. Another direction it can go, though, is it can go outwards, where we don't shame ourselves, but we blame others.
Yeah.
That was what was happening in the room today, this more recent group. And I want to spend a bit of time today chewing on this, this idea of how does it happen that we turn shame towards ourselves out towards others in terms of blame. And I want to unpack that psychologically together. So we're going to start with the term. Freud was the father of contemporary psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy. And there's been a lot of evolution in the field. Maybe people would say, thank goodness, since the days of Freud. But Freud named a number of what he called defense mechanisms, ways that we protect ourselves. And one of those defense mechanisms is the next slide, which basically is displacement, psychological displacement. I might have told this story here before, but I didn't tell it in this presentation. So I want to tell you a story as an example of displacement. And as I'm sharing the story with you, I want Odie and Austin and Bob and anybody who's participating with us today to be thinking of examples of this in your own life, because that's our exercise. So I'm prepping you for our exercise in just a moment. Talking about displacement now, where I can take a feeling inside and displace it onto somebody else. When I was 8 years old, I was in the kitchen of our home, and I was bending down to get something out of the cupboard. And as I came back up, there was a cupboard door up right above me, and it hit me right in the center of my top of my noggin, top of my head. It hurt like the dickens. It was really the corner, just bam, like that, like that. And so far, so bad, right? But it got worse. My sister Nancy, who was 6 at that point, walked in the kitchen. Big mistake. Big mistake. And so what I did is I lashed out at her. I don't remember what I said, but I know that it was mean. And I might have even screamed it at her. And this is one of the earliest instances for me of the inbreaking of conscience. Because even though my head hurt, I knew that in my heart of hearts, I knew that Nancy had nothing to do with it, and she didn't have anything to do with it. She just happened to have walked in at the wrong time in terms of where my wrath was. My wrath went towards her, and I can remember thinking to myself, there would have been a 3rd grade boy thinking, Bobby, that's really not cool. I don't know that I had the presence of mind to apologize to Nancy, but I've never forgotten that story ever since then. And that wasn't the only time. That was the first time that I was aware of doing that. I will imagine by that point I was well practiced. But at a certain point, just developmentally, you can begin to develop some kind of moral scruples about stuff, whether it's okay or not. That's not okay. That's an example of displacement. It's a simple example. It's a true example, and it's unforgettable to me. Enough so that when I began studying psychology, which was intensively about, was 42 years ago when I started as a psychology major in college, we studied displacement, and I remember thinking of Bobby hitting his head and yelling at Nancy, and it's always been sealed there. I was sharing with Odie before our podcast today that our topic is displacement, and that's the technical term from a psychological perspective. And I've heard others refer to this, and I think of it sometimes this way too. It's an unsavory image, but it's basically kicking the dog. And so just as I yelled at Nancy, it's taking out one's frustration, particularly on somebody who has very little power to resist. Nancy was younger than I was. A dog has very little say. And unfortunately, that literally happens. But the image is meant to communicate. Anytime that we take frustration or pain and redirect it towards somebody else, that's displacement. Now, we're talking specifically today about shame, and we're going to go more deeply into that in a few minutes. But for right now, can you think of a time where you have displaced frustration, anger, an ache in the middle of your head onto somebody else? So give yourself a moment to think about that. And then we're going to share. Odie and I are going to share. I've shared, so Odie, it's your turn whenever you're ready.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Anything come to mind?
Oh, yeah.
You say that with such confidence. Okay. As can I.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear.
So, The instance that I thought about was, not sure what I was doing, but I'm sure I was busy doing some sort of work at home,
Yeah.
and my wife came to me and asked me a simple question, and I was in the middle of something that was very frustrating with work, so I took that, and the way I answered her
Yeah.
question, wasn't loving.
Yeah.
So there's been plenty of instances like that, but at the moment, I don't think about it the way that I'm answering
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
It's not until later
Yeah.
or until she says something
Yeah.
that I think about it,
Yeah.
and it's like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
what? That wasn't directed towards her. That was really directed towards
Yeah.
the frustration
Yeah.
that I had.
Yeah.
But yeah, a
That's
lot of
a-
instances like that.
Perfect example of it. In fact,
A
I like
lot.
what you're saying. Well, yeah, in any intimate relationship like you with
Yeah.
your wife, this comes up a lot. It's very natural for us to do that. It's a way for us to relieve some of our pain by discharging it onto somebody else, much to their ill effect.
Right.
And I really appreciate something you said, is that as with Nancy bumping my head, my sister,
Mhm.
I'm sure it took me moving through the worst of the acute pain to own up to it.
Mhm.
And the same for you with your wife. In that moment, you're just pain, and you say it, and you probably don't even register it.
Yeah, exactly.
If she gives you feedback, then you do.
Yeah.
Whoa, okay, honey, I'm so sorry that I did that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a perfect example of displacement.
And another thought about you mentioned when we started talking about empathy, made me think about a situation that my wife went through most recently with a coworker. The way that they communicate through work, sometimes it's like through the phone. They give each other a ring. I think she had like a situation where her coworker didn't answered her in a way, like almost a similar situation. Her coworker
Okay.
answered her in a way that my wife didn't appreciate,
Mhm.
and so she confronted her coworker, and her coworker didn't really necessarily own up to the offense.
Okay.
She was just like, she apologized in a way of saying, "I'm sorry you felt that
Oh yeah,
way,"
which
you
is
know.
a real winner,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
But I told my wife when she told me about it, I told her, I was like, well, you know, it's maybe she's going through something that
Yeah.
you know, it's so don't take it personal.
Yeah.
And then she also said, yeah, but she usually does that, not necessarily to me a lot. This is my wife saying this, but a lot of people in the office notice that she has kind of a sour attitude.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
And so I was like, well, and also maybe she needs to work on having empathy, because, you know, the way that she reacts to people, maybe it's okay in her mind.
Yeah.
You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's not
yeah.
necessarily, maybe she isn't going through something. Maybe that's just the way that her character is. And so maybe that's a part of her character that she needs to work on, is having empathy. And just kind of how it affects everybody
yeah,
around her when
yeah.
you don't have
Yeah.
that empathy.
I think it's a great example. I appreciate you talking about it, Odie. Is that I feel like that as a basis for forgiveness, and we've discussed this before in our forgiveness practice, and I utilize this a fair bit in the work that I do in the recovery coaching, is that the basis for being able to forgive somebody, as well as to forgive ourselves, is in exactly what you're talking about, is an empathy. So you'd like ideally for your wife to imagine into this woman's, the coworker's experience.
Yeah.
I understand that your wife doesn't like it, and your wife has confronted it,
Yeah.
and that's frustrating. I get that. And also to take the next step towards bridging or even repairing that oftentimes requires for us to imagine, first of all, yours was a very generous interpretation, like maybe she's having a bad day.
Right.
And oftentimes that's the case.
Right.
But there's some people that string together a whole bunch of bad days in a row.
Yeah, exactly.
They've got some habits, let's say. And it isn't to say that they're not to be confronted, but I remember when I was a boy, I was a junior in high school, and my mom used to drop me off. My mom was a nurse, had to go to work early in the morning. We lived way out in the country, so she had to drop me off at high school in the morning. I played in a stage band. As a drummer, I played in the stage band, which it started at 8 o'clock in the morning before school, but my mom had to drop me off even before that. And so she dropped me off, and there was only one room on campus, or building on campus, that was open between 7 and 8 in the mornings at my high school, and it was the library. And so I'd go in the library, and I'd sit in the library. And truthfully, most of the time when I'd read in the library were music magazines. I was very much into jazz, so that got me reading Downbeat magazine religiously and reading back issues and so on. But occasionally what I would do is I'd just walk up and down the stacks of the library and kind of look at books and randomly pick a book off the shelf. And so I was 16, I was like I say, in a junior in high school. I remember walking down the row one day, and I pulled the book off the shelf, and it was by an American author. His name was F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'd never read anything by him. In fact, the truth is, I've only ever read one sentence by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I pulled the book off the shelf. The book was called The Great Gatsby. I pulled the book off the shelf, I opened it up, and I read the first sentence of it, and I was so blown away, I couldn't read anymore, and I closed it up and I put it back on the shelf, but I remember the first sentence, because it had such an impact on me. Now, this isn't verbatim, because if I could quote this verbatim, then I'd be a writer like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was one of the greats. I didn't know this at the time, but the sentiment was very powerful. It was something to this effect. It said, anytime I'm inclined to judge somebody, like your wife, this person, or you and me, anybody, anytime I'm inclined to judge somebody, I try to imagine walking a mile in their shoe, and when I do that, then I realize there's less and less basis for judgment. And in fact, I think he took it even further, that if I'd had their life experience, I would be exactly the same as them. Now that's a radical view. It's a radial view that he's talking about. It's the basis of Christian faith, which you know about in terms of the radical kind of empathy that Jesus modeled, and that is throughout the Gospels. It's at the core, I think, of all the religious traditions, this level of loving kindness or compassion, very much at the core of all major world religions. And here it was in this book. You can see why I could only read one sentence. I was filled up like that, immediately filled up by that. And I've never forgotten that. And I think as the basis for forgiveness, if I can do that, I've been a clinical psychologist in my career, a recovery coach and so on. I've worked with clients that sometimes bring in the most massive amount of suffering, and some of them are like the woman your wife works with. They create suffering for other people. But when I can make the translation that the suffering, let's say the trauma in their life, has led them to a place where they're bitter or insensitive or all the other ways that can go, it helps to kind of dissolve some of that knee-jerk judgment and resentment. It's like, oh, and in its place opens up the possibility of compassion. And I'm not advocating any more than you were with your wife that we don't assert ourselves, that we take a stand. It's really critical that we do that. But I think it makes all the difference to assert oneself with a heart of compassion versus just to take on an aggressive attitude and attack somebody as if they don't have a history, a la Fitzgerald. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense. Yeah, that's good.
This is how our conversations go longer.
Yeah.
Is there a comment up here? Ah, hi Bob and Odie. Angela here. Hello, Angela. Thanks for joining us. Great to have you with us. This is one of my favorite topics in the unshaming theme, empathy. I'm glad to hear you say that. And knowing you, I can vouch for that. I know that it's of high value to you. Angela joins us almost every week as a contributor to our weekly podcast, and she's also been on our podcast twice, and I highly recommend both of her podcasts here with Ask Addiction Specialists, and both of which have featured empathy right at the heart of the content. She goes on to say, I like the combination of accessing self-empathy through creativity. Thanks to you for introducing me to active imagination. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. You know, that makes me think, Angela, what we should do is maybe do a podcast or two on active imagination. Maybe we'll have you do that. I think that'd be really interesting. Or you and I in dialogue, how would that be? Yeah, active imagination is a technique that was developed by Carl Jung, who was the premier student I mentioned earlier of Sigmund Freud. And Carl Jung was instrumental in the development of AA and the 12-step movement here in the U.S. He was a Swiss psychiatrist, and he developed a technique called active imagination that, you're absolutely right, gives us an opportunity to empathize with ourselves, just the way we were talking about, just kind of finer and finer tuned empathy for the various layers of ourselves, including what he called our shadow, to have some kind of compassion for our shadow and actually move into dialogue in our imagination with that shadow. I think it's a great idea. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that. in preparing for today's podcast, and I think it would be a wonderful extension down the line. Thank you, Angela. Great to have you with us. So we're talking about times that we've projected onto other people and lashed out at them, and we've even now talked, thanks to Odie, about having empathy for those that do that, including ourselves when we do that. Let me ask you all a question. What do you imagine to be the consequences of what we're describing as psychological displacement? What are some consequences? They're actually built into the story that Odie was sharing, and even the story that I shared with you as well about lashing out at my sister. I think of it in two ways, and we're going to call these two ways under the umbrella. I'm going to call them the red alert mode. The red alert mode. That's the next slide. It's actually color coded. I'm very proud of myself. Thank you, Austin. The red alert mode, and how I'm thinking about this is just two sides of a coin. Is that when I react to frustration, you know what I want to do is I want to root this in shame. So let's say that you're feeling bad about yourself, and let's talk about this shame in the context of addiction. So that I'm dealing with addiction, I'm dealing with let's say I'm dealing with what in this 12-step program they call wreckage of the past. I'm dealing with pain I've caused, suffering I've caused other people owing to my addiction. And if I take that shame, that bad feeling inside, and displace it onto others, there's a couple of things, this is what I'm calling red alert mode, that are almost guaranteed to follow. One is that it will put me on the defensive. You know, you gave the example of this woman, and she's not here to defend herself, so we're going to go tread lightly here.
Right.
But the woman that works with your wife, and when your wife gives her feedback, I'm assuming your wife delivered the feedback in a respectful way, and the woman basically pushed it aside, didn't receive it, rejected it. That would be what
I wasn't there, so I can't really.
You're an incredibly fair person. I really appreciate that. It's very impressive. Is that to the extent that that woman or you or me aren't willing to receive feedback, and I'll just use that example, then it puts us in a defensive mode, and it makes it very hard to change if I can't be open. If you can't give me feedback, if I can't hear anything you say to me, especially something that's bugging you, then it doesn't give us an opportunity to repair our relationship, nor does it give me a chance to change my behavior. And so there's a way that leaves me in stuckness. So that's one side of the psychological displacement. If I'm always redirecting things away from myself, projecting them onto others, there's not much inner work that's going to go on, little chance for transformation. There's another way this can go, and I won't put this on I won't attribute this to the coworker of your wife because you did not include this. But one of the things it can do is it can put us kind of, not only are we defensive, but it can kind of put us into permanent offense mode where we actually attack other people. It's a way to, it's almost like a way to preempt anybody, if we're talking about shame, a way for me to preempt anybody shaming me is to be one step ahead of them. All of us do. I appreciate you talking about it. I'm willing to talk about it too.
Yeah, because there's certain situations, like just instances with my wife where just like the tone of her voice, you know, I'll already start getting in offense mode, or I don't know, maybe defense or offense, but
maybe both at the same time. Maybe you're not going to be very open to hearing what she says, and you might even try to do an end run and attack her first or come at her more aggressively. So it's a little bit of both. Is that true? Yeah, certainly is for me.
Yeah, so just like a simple statement. I can't give an example right now, but just like a simple statement.
You said something really good.
Yeah.
The statement sometimes doesn't matter as much as the tone of voice.
Exactly.
Isn't that crazy? Had somebody in group today when we were doing this interaction around non-shaming communication. He said, I'm going to give you an example of a passive-aggressive communication, which would be kind of slipping aggression underneath. And when he said it, I missed the passive-aggressive tone.
Right. And
the content of what he said sounded very straightforward. I looked at him and I said, I don't get the passive-aggressive. And he says, oh no, it was like the look in my eye, the tone of my voice. And for whatever reason, I missed it. So it was lost on me.
Right.
But if I was paying attention, it wouldn't have been lost. And his point was, it's not even the content. He was saying the right content, but saying in such a way that it had a lacerating kind of impact, or that could be intended to be that way. I'm not saying your wife wishes to do that to you, but we all have our red hot buttons. You know, when they get touched, all of a sudden you're in reactive mode. It's like, bam. And it can manifest both as not being receptive. That would be the defensive micro level. It can be us in relationships, like you're talking about with your wife.
Mm-hmm.
On a macro level, this is also can be very disturbing. I'll talk about it in terms of addiction. On a macro level, it can actually go to groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
So it may not be enough for me, if I'm in offensive mode, for example, and I'm constantly displacing my shame in an environment where with your parenting figures, whoever that was, that shame was I can't remember how to put it, but kind of a typical experience. I did not expect this. I think it was out of a group of maybe 15, I think maybe 14 people raised their hands. I didn't expect that many. But they were saying that it was like commonplace to be shamed. That was a typical response.
Would you say that's common in maybe, I don't know if this is the correct way to say it, but maybe people that have experienced some sort of addiction, do you think that's common where they grew up in a household where their parents not necessarily showed a loving manner, more of a kind of shaming, negative manner towards them?
It's a good question. We've talked here in the past about it, and I'll summarize it briefly, just because it is a good question. I was just kind of pondering where to go with that. And this is a good way to go with that. Back in the 1990s, the Kaiser Permanente hospital system did those studies, the Adverse Childhood Experience studies. They could refer to them as the ACE studies. And they looked at childhood trauma and how it predicts adult onset of various medical diseases. So they look at the prevalence of heart disease, lung disease, cancer, other chronic diseases, and they also included addiction in this. And what they discovered is that out of a population that's been diagnosed with active addiction, clinically diagnosed with addiction, that there's an incredibly high percentage, close enough to being almost 100%, that come from statistically high levels of trauma. Now the trauma can be everything from physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, very overt abuse, and emotional abuse might well fit in this. I've heard. I'll tell you why I paused a second ago. I was actually thinking of an example that came up in another group this week, and out of respect for confidentiality, I don't want to speak into the specifics. But it was somebody who talked about a parental response that was so incredibly cruel that there was hardly a dry eye in the room. It was just so painful to hear it. That's exactly where my mind went right now. And so that qualifies, an extreme example like that really qualifies as just full-on emotional abuse. Really just tearing somebody to shreds. And then there's other things that we may not think of as a childhood trauma that are included in the study that are oftentimes no less traumatic, which, for example, would be parental abandonment or rejection or deprivation. Parents that do not provide any connection, no support. And then there are other examples such as parental divorce is stressful, parental substance abuse, having parents that themselves are addicted, and so on the list go. Certainly parents and siblings that die. There's a whole list of these various traumas that one might experience in childhood, and that what they found in the addicted population was an incredible preponderance of these, enough so to set it aside from a normal population, hugely significantly. So that's to address your question. So when I asked the question in this morning's group, and 14 out of 15 people raised their hands, you might think, you might expect that. I wasn't thinking that when I asked the question. So there's that level of displacement that goes on. One of the terms that's used for this is scapegoating. And so if we stick with this example, let's say you have a very unhappy, themselves probably traumatized or deprived in childhood parents, who then turns towards a child and scapegoats the child with all of their unhappiness and just torments that child. That's not an atypical scenario with the clients that I work with. And then if you imagine taking that scapegoating energy and turning it towards a group of people. So it's those drummers from Texas. I'm in that group. And so on it goes, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think of how we can turn that same attitude from an individual, like a family member, towards a group or a class of people, or towards a gender, towards a nationality, towards an ethnic background, towards a language. It just goes on and on and on. And from a psychological perspective, we're talking about the psychological roots of that kind of prejudice, that kind of scapegoating. I want to ask a couple of questions, and you've already touched on the first one. You actually touched on both of them. I want to ask our participants, can you think of a time where you've been on the receiving end of scapegoating energy? Can you think of a time that you've been scapegoated? And what can I think about that? There's a comment. Austin? And this time I'll lead.
Okay.
Is that it's very humbling for me. I've worked my entire career as a clinical psychologist and fell into addiction in midlife, and you know my story, and I've talked about it openly here. And I don't believe, and because I was a psychologist, I worked with plenty of clients that themselves were either in active addiction, contemplating recovery, or were in active recovery from addiction. And I never felt judgmental. It wasn't in me. It would be hard for me to do that for lots of reasons, not the least of which is I come from a family where there was a lot of addiction in my family. And so it evoked a compassionate response inside for me. But I had no preparation for what it was going to be like to become addicted to alcohol and other drugs in midlife, and then to experience judgment from others. Yeah. And I'll tell you an irony, and I've thought of this in preparing for today's podcast. There's even a way sometimes, and this is really sad to me, there's even a way in treatment settings where there'll be a pecking order in terms of people who will judge other people, all of whom by definition are there because they're dealing with addiction, they're recovering from addiction. But my addiction isn't as bad as yours. That kind of attitude. Yeah. And so you even get that kind of, it's a natural human instinct to feel better about ourselves. But you even get that displacement going on, ironically, in treatment centers. But my introduction in terms of scapegoating was being aware of coming to people I knew in my life with my story. And thankfully, the people that are closest to me did not reject me. But I certainly experienced plenty of rejection and judgment along the way. It was enormously painful to me and eye-opening to me because I had worked in addiction for so long but didn't know firsthand what it was like to be on the receiving end of that. It was really, really painful. So that's an example for me of being scapegoated. Addiction is rampant. 2/3 of people in the United States have at least one person in their immediate family that is actively addicted, clinically addicted. So that's how common it is. And to the extent that somebody is embarrassed by that, 2/3 of people 2/3 of the people in the country have somebody in their family that's addicted. 2/3 of people in the family, if they did have somebody that's addicted, would not talk to anybody outside the family because of shame, because of the stigma. And so there's a setup there. If I can't talk about it, if I can't talk about addiction in my family, and you come into my life and you got addiction, there's a setup to displace that onto you, just like with Nancy in the cupboard. Now I can turn that towards you, and I can discharge all that energy towards you. And that's not the only explanation for it, but it's one, and there's many. And then to be on the receiving end of that is to get wiped out. Is like, rather than a compassionate response or understanding response, can be just absolute shaming. You have a thought about it?
I kind of had a different thought of what that meant, like scapegoating.
When you've been on the receiving end of having somebody judge you, let's say with prejudice, where they're scapegoating you. Right. And I guess it involves an interpretation, because that's not always this case. Right. No, I don't think all prejudice would be that way. There'd be lots of ways it could just be learned in a really dysfunctional way, let's say. But it would be somebody who's unhappy with themselves for whatever reason, and they turn that towards you and they judge you.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've had definitely instances where that happened, where maybe somebody is feeling a particular way, and they use like a phrase of "you made me feel this way," you know, kind of placing.
That's good. That's a good example.
You know,
that's a good
the
example.
way that they're feeling. on me as if like I can, I controlled their emotion. It's like you need to feel this way, but
It's a little bit like when I banged my head. My sister had nothing to do with that.
right,
But when she came in, I yelled at her as if she had made that happen.
right, yeah,
You made me hurt my head. She had nothing to do with it. Well, if we just take that into the emotional sphere, which is what I think you're talking about,
Mhm.
it's not uncommon, is it?
No, not at all.
You're making me angry.
Right.
You're making me sad. You're making me jealous. You're making me all these feelings, and I liked how you put it, as if you could do that.
Yeah, exactly.
If I'm not a willing recipient, you can't do jack
Right.
like that to me, right?
Yeah.
Or it's more complicated anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Okay. Good. I wasn't too sure because I know that there's. It does sound a little complicated because, and then I think of it on the other end. Well, my actions. Maybe my actions that I did contributed to the way that you're feeling. So maybe there's a certain. I don't know. It's a little confusing, but.
Well, I think this might be what you're talking about. Let's go with shame. Let's talk about
Okay,
shame.
yeah.
Let's say that already I'm a strange attractor for shame because I don't feel good about myself. You come along and you use a tone of voice. You're going to talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
You use a tone of voice, and I go, "How dare you make me feel ashamed?" Well, it's undeniable that you had a tone of voice, and you may have something going on for you that is intending to make me feel bad.
Right.
So it's not to disacknowledge that, but I also have a vulnerability to it.
Right. Yeah.
And there could be days where you don't have a tone of voice, but I hear that tone of voice, or I look at your eyes and go, I mean, you can think about this. Have you ever looked at somebody? I remember this happened one time at a gas station, and I was just about this close to getting clobbered. I just looked at somebody, and most of the time I look at people because I'm a Texan drummer, and Texan drummers look at people. I looked at this guy, and it was like, that was a mistake. And he saw in my eyes something that provoked him. I'm not sure that it was shame. It could have been maybe it was like he interpreted it as being hostile or whatever. And I was just basically being friendly. Boy,
Right.
that ended. Because he was going to pound me. And I think I apologized, got in my car, and Vamuski. I'm not even sure if I got gas. It's like, holy cow, that was like. So, and you know what I'm talking about. There's
Yeah,
situations
absolutely.
where to make eye contact with somebody, in some situations, I'm thinking particularly of males, there can be a thing that gets going that's actually seen as a provocation.
Yeah.
That was not what I was intended. So
Right.
felt very misunderstood. There's another term that came up for me as you were talking about this. It also comes out of psychology. It's referred to as evacuating the affect. I can evacuate. I can get rid of all of my shame by putting it onto you, including putting judgment onto you.
Yeah.
And so, I'm not ashamed. You did this to me. And it's like,
Yeah.
it makes me an innocent victim.
Right. Okay.
It gives me an opportunity to come after you and shame you. Because if it wasn't for you, I think about this sometimes in terms of couples therapy I've done. I sometimes will use this example. So it's like husband and wife comes in, and the husband says to the wife, or says to the therapist, says to me, says, you know what? No, he's looking at his wife and says, you're the person without I would be completely happy in my life. All of my, I'm not unhappy at work.
Right.
I get along with everybody. I just don't get along with you.
Yeah.
See how problematic that is? You're the person without whom I would be perfectly happy.
Yeah.
Obviously, if there's not some serious repair, that relationship is headed towards the brink.
Right.
But it's that idea of evacuating all of my unhappiness, all of my shame, all of whatever all of my anger onto somebody else.
Yeah.
Let's flip it around for just a second for those in our audience as well. Can you think of a time, rather than being on the receiving end, that you were on the giving end, that you were actually did this with somebody else? I won't repeat the example I started with today, but I gave you an example of scapegoating my sister for walking in the room on her own time. It wasn't a bad time. It was her time, and it was just happened to be simultaneous with my bumping my head seriously. Can you think of a time where you've judged somebody or some group based on what was going on inside of you, and you projected onto them, and this would be the idea of the scapegoat, where you send the goat into the wilderness with all of the sins of the people. Does one come to your mind?
The same one as before.
Repeat it.
So, just being frustrated with work,
Okay.
and
got it,
then
yeah.
my wife coming in at the wrong time and just
Yeah.
snapping at her.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's other instances that are different from that as well.
Yeah. I've got one.
Yeah, just judging others.
I've got one that comes to mind, and it's vulnerable to share it, but I wanted to see what came up. I don't think that I was judgmental of the people I worked with in therapy that were dealing with addiction, but I think I had a subtle kind of superiority.
Yeah.
I'm not, at least I'm not one of those.
Yeah.
And if you'd asked me, I would never probably have admitted it. I think I was scarcely conscious of it.
Right.
But I'll tell you something that's really revealed it to me. Not only my being on the receiving end of judgment, which has been eye-opening to me, as I said earlier, but also I think there's a general assumption. In fact, this was a conversation that we had today in one of our groups. There's a general assumption that can get going that somehow people that are addicted are stupid, or self-destructive, or self-sabotaging, or I don't know, just come up with your list of negatives. And some of us can be stupid for a day or for a time. It's not about that, but this is like a blanket judgment.
Yeah.
Blanket judgment.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you something that's been really made abundantly clear to me in the last 10 years of my work in addiction, my own recovery, and then working with those in recovery. I've been struck again and again how very many people that have suffered immensely in their lives with addiction are tender-hearted, and in many ways are more sensitive than most people, oftentimes incredibly creative, or at least potentially very creative, and also very bright, sometimes the best of the brightest. And I don't think I really had a clear beat on that until I was immersed in the work. That's all the work I do now, is working with people in recovery and their loved ones. And I'm not saying that all the things I said can all be trumped by active addiction. I believe they can be. But I've been struck by this again and again, the beautiful souls. I'm not just saying that. It really has been revealed to me in this work how many people have such worth and have been diverted by trauma, diverted by bad friends, bad choices, diverted by the biology of addiction, diverted by trying to regulate their brains in a way that's not useful because they've got depression or anxiety or ADD, all those things. But people with immense depth of spirit and soul and mind have really been struck by that. And so I want to identify that as a way that I could have joined a general cultural scapegoat, which is, why can't these people just say no? Well, there's about a million reasons why it's sometimes hard to say no. And as I said today, it's not that there are any excuses. There are a million reasons, and we're still fully responsible, each one of us, for our own recovery. But there are a million reasons, and so I feel like that any way that I would have oversimplified addiction in the past has been radically modified by my own experience with myself and in the work I do.
And I can relate with that as well. When I first went to groups for SA, sexual addiction, I felt similar, because I was listening to these other men's stories. I was just thinking to myself, like, oh, I guess I'm not that bad off after all. But getting further into the group and getting to know the men around me, I started to think, well, and so I started to change my thinking of, instead of, oh, I'm not that bad off after all, it kind of scared me a little bit, like, I need to fix whatever it is that I'm doing, because I don't want to potentially lead down this path. But and another thing off of that is that I realized that these men were probably outside of the group, I can be vulnerable with them, and I can share like deep things that I feel like I couldn't share with somebody else. So that's all of what I began with, pretty much, as the judgment. Was replaced with all these other things of what not to do, and I can be vulnerable with these other people. So.
Really identify with all that you're saying. It's one of the surprising benefits being in recovery, being involved in self-help support groups, to be with other people that get it, and to move, just as you're just saying, to move from, well, I'm not as bad as them, to we're all in the soup together with this,
Yeah, exactly.
and how can I heal myself? Listening to the stories that I'm hearing, I want to learn from them, but it's less and less at arm's length, and it's more and more with kind of like arm around shoulder, like we're in this together.
Right.
I really feel that radically.
Yeah.
Feel that radically. I had somebody say to me last Friday in one of the groups I led, they said, Dr. Bob, you relate to people in our groups no matter what age they are. I'm always the oldest person in the room, and oftentimes old to the order of being old enough to be grandparents of people in the room. And I really appreciated them saying that.
Yeah.
And I thought about this weekend, what this individual said. I thought about what he said, and I realized that it's really related to what you just said, is that I don't feel separate. I don't feel separate from anybody by function of age. Most of the groups I lead are with men. I have some female clients in groups and so on, but most of them are men. But it doesn't matter to me if they're men or women. Sexual orientation, ethnic background, drug of choice. I feel like we're just all in this together. I feel that radically. I think that's what this person was commenting on.
Yeah.
We eventually get to a place where you feel the commonality. And we talked about how it is that what heals shame is empathy. That's what we're really talking about.
Right.
Your empathy for the people you've been in groups with, my empathy, and that there's healing. We're going to wrap up. We're going to wrap up with this. Can you imagine a world in which the empathy that Odie is talking about, or that I've been sharing, can you imagine if that was the norm? I know it's not without complications. If you've been a family member or a loved one of somebody who's deceived you and betrayed your trust, of course there's going to be residual from that. There's going to be pain from that. But can we imagine moving through that pain without adding fuel to the fire by making somebody bad? Somebody just gave a kind comment to Odie, and I want
Thank
to
you.
as well. Your insights are wonderful, Odie. It's great. The combination of Odie and Bob is more than the sum of its parts. I really appreciate our synergy, our interaction together. So imagine a world in which we move with compassion and empathy rather than shame and blame. I want to recommend this. There's hope here, and I want to make a recommendation for any of you that have been with us for a period of time and care to review previous podcasts. There's abundant material in the podcast that we've done to date for doing what I call unshaming, which is to find ways of redemption, to find ways of healing, to find ways of compassion, and bringing those in our lives on a daily basis. And I want to recommend that if you've been with us, that you set out an intentional plan for how today, how tomorrow, you're going to work on this. I've shared with you in the mornings I get up and I practice forgiveness practice each morning. It's my attempt to internalize what we're talking about so that I become less and less judgmental, less and less prone to scapegoating. Angela, you shared as you responded earlier, and thank you for that. You shared this practice of active imagination, where you go into dialogue with parts of yourselves, including parts of yourselves that you'd like to hide, the so-called shadow and so on. That's another practice. And then imagine what it would be like to bring this into our world. So you go home to your wife, and when you're working and distracted and maybe irritated, that maybe you're just 1 degree less apt to bite her head off. Or maybe you do, and you take less time to repair that. I don't know that I bite people's heads off less.
Yeah.
Maybe I do, but I think I recover more quickly. And so I think that that's a grace. I think that's in the right direction. We're not talking about becoming perfect here, perfect human beings, if that means without blemish. We have limitations, but just self-awareness. We were talking in the group today about just monitoring ourselves. How do we keep an eye on how we're doing? How do we catch ourselves? How do we repair, in your case, with your wife? For me, with my wife as well, and with people that we love. How do we do that? And so can we make a plan to do that? Can we make a plan to be with somebody and extend compassion to them when it might help heal some of their own shame as well? I charge you with that task. I'd be very interested to hear from you. You're welcome to reach out to me at my website and let me know what you're thinking. It's drbobweathers.com, and I'd love to stay in dialogue. We'll continue this conversation. I want to thank you, Odie. Thank you for being with me today, and
Thank you.
For you all being with us today. Let me say a word as we wrap up, is that next week, 2 weeks from today, I'll be out of town. We won't be meeting 2 weeks from today. But next week we will be meeting, and in that meeting I want to discuss 2 upcoming seminars that I'm involved in, which is why I'll be out of town. I'll be going to Philadelphia in 2 weeks to speak to 3 different schools of pharmacy there. Actually, I'm not speaking to the schools of pharmacy. They'll be there, but they've opened this up to the public. It turns out that Philadelphia has the highest mortality rate in the nation of any major metropolitan city to opioid abuse. More people are dying owing to opiate overdoses. And so they've invited me to come to address the opioid epidemic, and specifically interested in my addressing the stigma around addiction that actually feeds into it. Thank you, thank you. So I'll be gone in 2 weeks, and I'll be previewing a little taste of that presentation next week, so all of you can come to Philadelphia and support me. Okay. And the very following week after that, I'll be here, but the following week I've been invited by the state of Kansas to do a webinar, and I'll be meeting with the mental health providers in the state of Kansas who work with those in recovery from addiction. So this will be a statewide presentation I'll be doing, and it will be on addressing cultural issues, and they're embedded in our conversation today. When we talk about scapegoating, one of the easiest ways to scapegoat is to scapegoat another culture other than my own. If when I was in graduate school, anytime I had an elective, I took cultural anthropology courses. They were offered, and I loved taking them. And one of my favorite, actually my favorite professor in graduate school, Chuck Kraft, once said that it's blatantly unfair from a cultural anthropological perspective. It's blatantly unfair to pick the best of one's own culture and then judge another culture based on its worst. In other words, to compare unfavorably, whether it's a culture or an individual. It's unfair for me to compare myself with you, and I'll pick a strength and I'll criticize you for a weakness, whether we do that individually or culturally. So I'll be addressing cultural issues in that presentation in Kansas, and I'll bring that next week too to give you a taste of that. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. Come back next week for a preview of Philadelphia and Kansas. We won't be meeting in 2 weeks, then we'll pick up after that, okay? Wish you well. Have a good week. Here's to compassion, empathy, unshaming. Bye-bye for now.